Welcome everyone to the call today. Thank you to POGI for inviting me on and for commissioning this research that, as Becky explained, is very important for business planning and policy development. So I hope that people have had a chance to review the presentation I sent. I was hoping that we could send out the actual report, but we're in the very final stages of finalizing it, so the report should be out shortly. So with that mentioned, just note that everything that is presented today is not final numbers, that there may be slight updates with the actual release with the report. So just keep that in mind as we go through. So starting on the first slide about the data, as Becky mentioned, this is the third year that CODA has produced this report in collaboration with POGI. And how it works is CODA has provided data from the certification bodies that certify to the Canadian organic regime. So this is a voluntary provision of data, and we essentially have to work with what we're given. So with that being said, the numbers and the figures that we present are our best estimates with the data provided, and we fully acknowledge that sometimes there are data errors in what's given to us, and there's different formats that we're given the data that make it a little bit more difficult to have fully accurate numbers. But we're doing our best to improve that each year, and I really appreciated working with folks at POGI and having a few other experts across the Prairies who helped with recategorizing some of the categories that we had in previous years that were a little bit troublesome. So if you'll notice, looking at the report once it comes out, that it'll be a little bit different from last year in some of the figures because we've changed these categories. So just keep that in mind once you see the full report come out. So fair warning, I'm going to be throwing a lot of data your way. And if you haven't seen the report, or the presentation that's been circulated, it'll be a lot of numbers, but bear with me. And I really appreciate having comments and feedback at the end. I know we won't have too much time for it, but I'll also make sure that my email's circulated. So looking at whether it's the presentation or when the final report comes out, if you have any questions, I would love to hear them, because this is how we learn to make the report better year to year, to see what people are saying once they see it. So I'm going to move on to the key findings of the report. So we found between 2015 and 2016 that certified organic operations in the Prairies increased from 1,499 to 1,632. And we saw about 200,000 acres added from 1.4 to 1.6 million. And the figures show that the Prairies are home to half of Canada's organic acreage and a third of our country's organic crop producers. And the number of crop producers that we have recorded is at the highest since 2010, which is very exciting. And Alberta in particular stood out as a high growth area in terms of operations, in particular with 70 new producers added between 2015 and 2016. So most of that growth was found in the Mackenzie County region. In Saskatchewan and Manitoba, the producer number is a little bit more stagnant, with only 10 to 12 added, but there was an increase of 20% acreage in each province. So that may lead us to think that perhaps there's more of a trend of consolidation, that producer numbers aren't necessarily growing, but they are expanding, or multiple operations are becoming one as they get consolidated. And then we see livestock operations increase slightly from 118 to 132. So if we look at the overview of operations again, we have a table there, Table 1, which shows the breakdown of crop producers, livestock operators, and processors by province. So again, I would highlight the significant growth in Alberta, and as well as the growth in processor numbers. So we'll see a processor chart in a couple of slides that maybe I'll speak to it once we get there. But again, a lot of growth in Alberta, in particular crop producers, and growth in processors. So specifically looking at crop producers, the Prairie total is the highest that it's been since 2009. The 2009 high was 1,610, and this year we have in 2016 it was 1,442. And this represents over a third of Canada's crop producers. So that's the highest portion of the Canadian portion of crop producers since 2011. When we look at the processor slide, you can see in Figure 2, certified organic processors in the prairies, that the 2015 stats were quite a bit lower than 2014. That wasn't unique to the prairies. We saw that across the country, so we weren't quite sure if that was a data error from the data that we were provided and how it was analyzed, but we see that that was across the country, and this year it's bounced back up to what would seem more normal based on the 2014 numbers, so we would think that maybe the 2015 numbers are quite representative of what the case actually was. So that's something to note when we look through the report. Livestock operations, Figure 3, similar to crop producers, livestock operations had the biggest jump in Alberta with 12 new operations between 2015 and 2016, with the addition of 14 overall in the prairies. Moving on to the overview of acreage. So that's Table 4, organic acreage in the prairies. As I mentioned, the total acreage increased from 1.41 million to 1.64 million, so over 200,000 acres added. I did notice a typo in this table, so the Canadian total in 2015 was 2.44. In 2016 it was 2.90, not 2.30. So that was showing an increase of about 500,000 acres nationally, and over 200,000 of that was in the prairies. The next slide, Figure 4, shows the breakdown, the growth over time and the breakdown by province. So as I mentioned, a lot of the growth in operations was in Alberta, but the growth in land, Alberta only showed about 3% increase in organic lands, whereas Manitoba and Saskatchewan both had about 20% increase, 2015 to 2016. So those are noticeable trends to keep track of. Table 5, we have a breakdown of acreage by province, and you'll notice that if you've looked at, or if you saw the 2015 report, that some of our categories have changed. We had to collapse some categories due to some of the, we call it dirty data, that sometimes the data, it's hard to provide subcategories because the data isn't specific enough for us, or sometimes we get, say, an acreage number of for an operation. It says it has 1,000 acres, but then it lists every type of crop that's on it, so we can't break out whether it's vegetable acreage is a certain amount, field crop another amount, pasture another. So that's why we had to introduce an uncategorized category. Only Alberta and the prairies had any acreage that fell into that, because we did have too many different land use types within one total of acreage. That being said, the expansion of organic lands in the prairies, mostly driven by pasture, forage, and natural areas, which constituted 53% of land. Field crops essentially made up the rest, with fruit and vegetables and uncategorized land each having under 1% of total land. Looking at field crops, nationally 89% of organic field crops are in the prairies, and the prairie field crop acreage, 2/3 of it is cereals, so that's the dominant acreage there. And as well, most of that acreage is within Saskatchewan, which is not surprising. And wheat is the highest category. So I mentioned again on this slide data collection issues. So that's pointing to something that's mentioned a couple times in the report, that at times we receive data from the CDs that will list a certain crop that's on land, and it's not identified whether it's a field crop or used for green manure. Sometimes it's identified, sometimes it's not. So that would mean that there's a bit of discrepancy between whether something is put into the field crop category, or if it's green manure, it would be under the pasture, forage, and natural areas category. So that's why we see some differences in the growth from year to year, and discrepancies there than what what folks on the ground may see. So I welcome any comments on the acreage stats that we present if people have any concerns about those. So cereals is the largest. Then we see pulses. Pulses had pretty significant growth, 2015 to 2016. Might be due to the increased interest in growing pulses and plant-based proteins, the designation of, I believe it was 2016 as the year of pulses by the FAO. So there was 33% growth in pulse acreage across the prairies, organic pulse acreage between 2015 and 2016, making 79% of Canada's organic pulses are in the prairies. And then lentils remain the largest, followed by peas and beans. Next, we have oil seeds. So somewhat similar to pulses, 73% of Canada's organic oil seeds are in the prairies. I noted that the second point there I have on the slide for oil seeds I didn't complete, but oil seed acreage actually dropped between 2015 and 2016 by 8%. So something that we'll watch moving forward, and flax is the largest category. Some additional findings. So you'll see in the report there's a few more tables there that with the main findings being that other field crops, which, let me just find my list here of what that includes. So other field crops include amaranth, borage, buckwheat, hemp, popping corn, quinoa, and any other crops that are recorded across multiple field crop categories. So for example, if there's an operation that's listed as having a certain amount of acreage and it lists barley, lentils, mustard, and corn as what's within that acreage, then we can't divide it into any of the other categories. It would fall under other field crops. So this category doubled, so that's possibly due to differences in reporting rather than the subcategories having significant growth. Then we saw pasture, forage, and natural areas increase by about 130,000 acres. Again, I would point out the discrepancies in whether something's categorized as a field crop or green manure or forage. So something that we're keeping an eye on as we continue doing these analyses. And then we have fruit and vegetable acreage up about 800 acres from 2014 to 2015. And then at the end of the slides, I'm not going to go through it in much detail. I'm going to leave that in your hands for people to have a look at. But we also have the comparison for each province. We have the breakdown of the acreage between 2015 and 2016 with the absolute change in acreage and the percent change by each province. So I would suggest having a look at those and seeing if there's anything there that you find inconsistent. So with that being said, I will turn it over for any questions, and then as I mentioned, I will make sure that my email is circulated so that people can send any comments or questions to me directly about what's included in the presentation. So thank you, Pogi, for having me on, and I look forward to your questions.